Just gonna make sure I hit start. Okay. So thank you everybody for coming. This is the continuation of our X64 Brown Bag series. And today we have Emily Bird with us, who's going to be talking about tracking, accounting, and reporting clean water progress. So I'm going to turn it right over to Emily.
Thank you, Maddie.
Sure.
So, hi everyone. My name's Emily Bird. I work in the Clean Water Initiative program here at DEC, and I'm responsible for all of our work related to tracking, accounting, and reporting. And so that's pretty much what I'm going to be covering today to bring all of our partners and stakeholders up to speed on what we're currently developing to set up systems for tracking our clean water progress. So just so folks know, the Clean Water Initiative program used to be called the Ecosystem Restoration Program. We've gone through some strategic planning, and our 4 main objectives for our work is to coordinate implementation of Tactical Basin Plan priority actions, and Tactical Basin Plans are done in the Monitoring, Assessment, and Planning program, also within the Watershed Management Division here at DEC. And we also have the objective of maintaining and administering funding to support that implementation, to track progress, and to communicate our outcomes. So the focus of today's presentation is on our work to track progress. So today during the presentation, I'm going to be covering why we're developing this tracking system, what's the point of it. That relates to the Vermont Clean Water Act, or Act 64 as it's commonly referred to. Also the Lake Champlain TMDL accountability framework. So TMDL is total maximum daily load, and that's the restoration plan for Lake Champlain to limit phosphorus loading into the lake and to restore water quality, and also statewide to track implementation of tactical basin plans. So I'm also, once we give some of that context of why we're doing all of this, I'm going to go over what we're tracking and how. So getting into the scope of our clean water activities, how we're tracking outreach and technical assistance, as well as projects and BMPs, explaining the multi-purpose function of all of the data and information we're collecting and how we're going to use it to meet multiple reporting requirements and also transparency for the public, and then go over some of our potential anticipated changes for grantees, how this might impact your reporting and projects, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end, I expect, for questions and answers. So the purpose of our tracking system is to first meet our reporting requirements that are established through Act 64 and the Lake Champlain TMDL accountability framework. It also is to track our progress implementing tactical basin plans statewide, and that process will inform adaptive management of what progress are we making, where there still needs to be more implementation, and identifying that gap to inform our priorities. And then finally, and probably most importantly, a level of transparency for the public, the legislature, and stakeholders about how we're doing meeting clean water goals, and also how state investments are being made and what they're getting for their money and investment. So I'm going to start with an overview of the Vermont Clean Water Act. Act 64 establishes reporting requirements, and so we're going to be required to track on all clean water activities across all sectors, looking at ag, forest, lakes, rivers, roads, wastewater, wetlands, stormwater, you name it. Across all sectors, we're responsible for tracking and reporting on that progress. And that covers everything from planning and design projects through to implementation and BMPs. So each year, we're going to be submitting our annual Clean Water Initiative investment and performance report to the legislature, and that will also be made available to the public. And in that report, we're going to address some social measures, investment measures, performance measures, and environmental measures. And those environmental measures address TMDL implementation and the status of implementing our major TMDLs in the state, as well as co-benefits, so the additional benefits aside from nutrient and sediment reductions, looking at flood resiliency, habitat, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. So our other big reporting need is related to the Lake Champlain TMDL accountability framework and how that process works. And this is articulated in the current draft TMDL, which is yet to be finalized. But it's articulated where the TMDL establishes our overall phosphorus reduction targets. Then, through the tactical basin planning process, the basin planners and our monitoring, assessment, and planning program, they're going to be taking that target and through the planning process identify 5-year interim phosphorus targets that are going to be met within that planning cycle, which is on a 5-year cycle. So then they're also going to be identifying actions necessary within 5-year period in order to meet those 5-year interim targets for phosphorus reductions. And as those actions are implemented, we're going to track them through our funding programs and also through regulatory programs and quantify the average annual phosphorus load reduction achieved through priority implementation projects. And then finally, we'll be measuring that progress against the TMDL targets and the 5-year targets, and EPA is going to look at that whole process and provide us with an interim and final report card at the end of each planning cycle. How are we doing implementing the TMDL? So this kind of demonstrates what that process will look like, and it's a cyclical process that is aligned with the tactical basin planning schedule. So in year 1, for any of the planning basins that are shown here on this map, the year 1 year is noted in that little oval associated with the planning basin. We're going to be updating those tactical basin plans. And this is part of the statewide tactical basin planning process, but I'm just highlighting the Lake Champlain Basin specifically as it relates to the TMDL accountability framework. So then in year 3, EPA is going to be issuing an interim progress report. How are we doing meeting the goals we said we were going to work to meet in the tactical basin plan? And so they'll issue an interim report card. There will be an assessment of our progress meeting our implementation goals. And then when we get to year 5 for any given planning basin, they're going to issue their final report card saying how we did and where there's room for improvement as that tactical basin plan is updated for the next cycle. And then you go back to year 1 and it repeats. And all throughout that process, we're going to be implementing priority actions. So the idea is that we're going to be updating the format of how these implementation tables are managed. They're going to be continuously updated as assessments inform our priorities so that you won't have to wait until the next planning cycle for a basin to know what the up-to-date priority actions are. So there's going to be a continuous implementation process that will be occurring throughout this cycle, and there will be check-in points both internally and with the EPA report cards. So just a little review of the tactical basin planning process for those who might not be familiar with it. And this is something that occurs, like I said, in our Monitoring, Assessment, and Planning Program, or MAP. They take the results of a bunch of different water quality monitoring efforts and several assessments and different planning efforts on the ground, and they somehow integrate it all and translate it into an implementation table. So that's what's shown here on the right. And that implementation table informs the 5-year priority actions for that particular basin to meet the water quality goals for the basin. And what we're going to be doing is taking the implementation table and tracking those projects through the various stages, all the way from planning and design, feasibility, through to implementation, and that's all going to be captured in one database. So the database that we're going to be using to track progress, that I'll be getting into a little bit more, that's also where those implementation tables will live. So it's going to be a very fluid process that will allow us to track progress directly from the implementation tables and track those projects through to implementation, and where, for example, we may have planning and feasibility projects that we fund and those result in project ID, that will go back and inform the implementation table. So it will be kind of a feedback loop that allows us to keep these up to date. So we currently have a database. This is a screenshot of the landing page right now. And this is under development, but it is functional for some of the more basic functions. So we are currently using this to track what information we have available for our ecosystem restoration grant program projects. And it's very exciting. The basin planners are starting to utilize this database to populate their implementation tables. And I want to highlight just one important piece of this implementation planning process that will also be housed within the database in a separate function, and that's called stage gate criteria. So this is something that's under development in our MAP program, where it establishes criteria for different project types that allow them to move through different stages, but it has this funneling effect where only the highest priority projects that are ripe for funding are going to make it onto the next stage. So by the time you get to implementation, you know that it's the highest priority projects that are going to be queued up for implementation. And this kind of demonstrates how you might have an assessment in this first funnel that identifies lots of projects. And then that is run through the stage gate criteria that is currently being finalized. And that informs our implementation table. And then the implementation table informs our funding programs and what the priorities should be for funding projects. And then the funding programs might fund a priority design project, or it might go straight to implementation. So an example where that might happen is where you have riparian buffer planting, and you might not need as complex of a design, but you might go to design for a more complicated stormwater treatment project. So this kind of sets the stage for why we're tracking. We want to be able to track the progress of implementing the tactical basin plans and monitor progress implementing implementation tables. And we're going to do that by tracking all of the clean water activities across sectors. So this slide here kind of outlines the three major buckets of activities that we're going to be tracking. So the first is clean water related outreach, also technical assistance, which addresses project review, site visits, meetings with landowners, that sort of thing, and then also clean water projects and best management practices. So for each of these activities, I'm going to explain what the scope of those activities are, so what's the universe for the activities we're tracking, what data and information we're collecting for each of those activities per unit, and then how we're managing the data and how we're going to summarize the results and report out. So for outreach, I'm going to cover the scope, the data collected, some examples, how we're managing the data, and what the summary output looks like. So we currently have a system in place for tracking all state agency provided outreach related to clean water, and also for partners with state or federal funding conducting that type of outreach. So this includes workshops, trainings, and public and stakeholder meetings. So for each individual event, we're tracking the subject, the purpose, the date, the location, the geographic focus, the organizer's affiliation, also presenter's affiliation, and then the type of outreach conducted and the targeted audiences. And in addition to those identifiers, we're tracking some event data. So the number of attendees for any given event, the hours of instruction provided, also if the event was evaluated, so we can start to get a sense of how many of the people conducting outreach are evaluating those events, because in the long term we want to figure out a way to measure the actual impact and not just how much outreach we're doing. So that's to get an understanding of how much it's evaluated currently. And then whether or not this is part of a certification program, so a training that might be for certified manure applicators, that might be tracked as a yes for part of a certification program. And then we want to see how the event was promoted, so we can look at how our partners and state agencies are getting the word out and what's effective. So here's an example of an actual reported outreach event that was the Two Rivers RPC. They held a meeting in February on the Municipal Roads General Permit with our Jim Ryan from the Stormwater Program attending. And they went through the Municipal Roads General Permit and also a training on the road erosion tool. So you can see all of the different event-specific information that was tracked associated with that piece of outreach. And then how we're managing these data. So we have this online form that we call N-Form. It's through A&R Online. And it's an online form that is being utilized by VTrans, Agency of Ag, and A&R to track all of their clean water outreach. And so all those different agencies, in addition, the regional planning commissions and Vermont League of Cities and Towns, they're doing a lot of outreach. with state funding. They are currently utilizing this form, and we're collecting all of the data and information I just described for each outreach event, and we're tracking that in an outreach database. And then periodically, most likely once a year when we're putting together our annual report, we're going to summarize the results out of that database, looking at the number of events held, the number of attendees reached, the targeted audiences reached, so how are we doing reaching our targeted audiences? Are there any gaps, or does this match with our priorities? Also looking at the hours of instruction provided and received. And then separately, we're going to summarize the level of technical assistance, and that's currently tracked in different forms through the different agencies. So we're not going to be incorporating that into our tracking system, but we will incorporate a summary of that in our annual reporting. All right, now getting into clean water projects. This is the next big bucket of category of projects or activities we're tracking. So I'm going to go through the scope, what this includes, what data we're collecting or going to be collecting, because we are adding some additional measures, and then how those data are managed and some examples. So how we're going to be populating this database, we're going to be tracking all of the projects that are implemented for clean water through grant-funded programs. So this will cover the Clean Water Initiative program, and we're also going to be working with VTrans, an agency of ag, to receive into our database all of the different projects that they're implementing with clean water funding. So this covers the Better Roads program, and then the ag BMPs implemented and tracked in the Ag Partners database, and that will be reported out to DEC at the watershed scale. And then we're also in the process of developing procedures for how we're going to track implementation of regulatory programs, so maybe implementation of a stormwater permit. But today's presentation is really focused on how we're going to be tracking grant-funded projects, because the regulatory piece is still under development. So grant-funded projects, these are projects that are funded through DEC Clean Water Initiative program, other A&R funding programs, VTrans Better Roads, and Agency of Ag funding programs. And this covers everything from assessment projects, so projects that are identifying projects, planning, feasibility, and design projects, and implementation of best management practices. So in this left little sheet report shape, we have what we're currently receiving information and data on these projects that are either in the grant agreement or in their final performance reports that are submitted to DEC. And that includes very simple information like the project title, what type of project it is, a description, locational information like the town or region where it was implemented or conducted, the basin, partners involved, funding information like the grant number, funding source and amount, and any match. So what we are going to be changing, not so much the information we're collecting, but instead of just having it in these separate documents and grant files, we're going to have this information stored in a database, so it will be easier to access and report out on. And one addition to this basic information is the addition of lat long, because we want to be able to put projects on a map so we can use that in our communications to show where these projects are taking place. So this is a quick example of what this might look like for any given project in our database. You have the basic project information, the lat long, the project type, towns and regions, the basin involved, and any partners involved with the project. And we're also tracking events, which include financial events. So this is where the grant information would be stored in the database. You can see here we have a grant, the funding source, the amount, and the grant number, the funding category. So this is an implementation project, and the funded partner. And we also have other events like the project was added to the database or the project was completed and closed out. So we're tracking those, and we'll likely be adding additional events as we begin tracking these projects through various stages. So you might have one project with multiple grants associated with it, just as an example of what that might look like. So Moving on from the basic project information, we're also going to be tracking project measures. So performance measures probably sound pretty familiar for anyone who's received an ERP grant. We're going to continue tracking these performance measures. So for a design project, that might be something like the number of designs completed. For an implementation project, like a stormwater treatment project, it might be the acres of runoff treated. So we're going to continue tracking those, but instead of it being in separate reports, separate documents, we're going to incorporate that into our database. And in addition to performance measures, we're going to be adding measures of co-benefits. So looking at habitat connectivity or flood resiliency, socioeconomic values, things that kind of paint the full picture, not just looking at the water quality impact. So I'll get into what that might look like, but those measures are currently under development. And then we're also going to be tracking, for implementation projects only, the TMDL implementation piece of it. So looking at the nutrient load reduced over time associated with the BMP. And all of that will be tracked in our database. So this is a little review of what our current performance measures look like. This definitely doesn't cover all of them, but it summarizes some of the measures that we're currently capturing for different project types. So like I said, for a planning project, it might be the acres or miles assessed by that project. Or for a design project, the number of projects identified, or the number of designs completed. We also have things like illicit discharge detection and elimination projects, so the number of illicit discharges identified, and everything down all the way to wetland restoration with the number of acres restored. So that kind of gives us a sense of the quantity of work that's being implemented on the ground. And this is an example of how this is currently captured in our database. So under this Measures tab, we're tracking the type of measure, which is captured as an event, the unit and the value, and then also the status. So we might have a proposed measure, and then when that project's completed, we would add an active measure, as well as the start date, so when that happened, because each year we're going to want to report on the performance measures achieved within a certain time period. And then just to get into the co-benefits piece, which is currently under development, but we're looking at opportunities to quantify the benefits of these types of projects that have a water quality benefit, but also support flood resiliency, habitat structure and connectivity, and socioeconomic values. So a lot of these projects would be natural resource related projects, and demonstrating that these projects have lasting long-term benefits that are above and beyond what you might get from a traditional treatment BMP. And then getting into the TMDL implementation piece of things, this whole process is currently under development, and we'll certainly be requesting input as we move through this, but just want to summarize kind of how it will work. So we're in the process of developing systems that will allow us to track pollutant load reduced from non-point source, stormwater, BMPs, as well as wastewater treatment facilities through their monthly reporting, and then measure those reductions relative to our TMDL targets. And because of the Lake Champlain TMDL accountability framework coming up, we are starting with the Lake Champlain TMDL, but we are going to be putting similar systems in place for Lake Memphremagog once that TMDL is approved, and then also covering the other portion, major basin of the state, the Long Island Sound, Connecticut River Basin. So for the Lake Champlain TMDL accountability framework, we're going to be tracking BMPs and the phosphorus load reductions that are achieved. And so what this will look like for BMP reporting, which is going to be a new reporting requirement that we're going to work through and definitely give some thorough outreach and training on, so not to worry, but we're currently developing this process and the methods for that process internally. But we're going to be reporting, having our grantees report on the BMP location, the area treated by a BMP, so that would include the land use of the area probably draining into that BMP, and other characteristics like soil type and slope. And then also BMP characteristics that are based on the BMP type. So different BMP types will need different types of information in order for us to estimate the reduction associated with that BMP. Mm-hmm. So all of these characteristics will be reported and brought into our database, and then the database will have a functionality built into it that will allow us to estimate the phosphorus load reduction, which is an annual average reduction. So the BMP accounting and tracking tool, it's a tool that was developed by Tetra Tech with EPA contract support. It's based on the same model that was developed to inform the Lake Champlain TMDL. So that function will be brought into our database, so it all lives in one place. But basically how that works is it estimates the base load that's coming off of the land for the area treated. And then, so that's all based on the same model as the Lake Champlain TMDL modeling. And then it applies a BMP efficiency based on the BMP characteristics to that base load. So that gets you your annual average reduction for that BMP. And then we'll be tracking all of that over time in the database. So we currently have the ability to track these data and information for BMPs in the database, but the functionality is not quite there yet. So we're in the process of testing and developing this tool, but just wanted to give you a glimpse of what it might look like, how it's managed in our database. So we do have a TMDL tab in the database, and you can add BMPs or BMP systems within that tab. So you could have multiple BMPs associated with one project, or these BMPs can be standalone. And then for each BMP, you have the lat long and the land use treated, and that addresses the land use type, the acres, the soil, and slope. And then that generates the base load. And then you also have the BMP characteristics, so you indicate the type of BMP and indicate any additional information that's necessary to generate an estimate for that BMP. And so how this will work, just a little schematic for managing these data. Just to remind you all, we are going to be receiving the BMP data from the Ag Partner database and also road-related BMPs from VTrans. That's all going to be in our tracking system database. And then we're going to send those BMP characteristics through the BMP accounting and tracking tool that I just explained, and that generates an estimate of the phosphorus load reduced per BMP. Then it assigns it back into the database. So then we're able to take what we have from the database and report out on the load reduced over time relative to TMDL targets. And because we're also tracking financial information, we're able to see the cost effectiveness of those reductions in most cases. And then we can separate that and parse it out by the sector, source, or waste load allocation target identified in the TMDL, and also by lake segment and watershed. So all of that I just described has many purposes for meeting different reporting requirements and communication needs. So this kind of summarizes the four main needs that we currently have. So we have the Lake Champlain TMDL accountability framework. We have our annual reporting required by X64 and the Vermont Clean Water Act. We also have, which I haven't mentioned yet, the state of Vermont has results-based accountability, which is a performance measure process to track performance of state agencies over time. So DEC has a results-based accountability report that we produce each year, and some of these data we're tracking can inform that process. And then also, most importantly, the public and our stakeholders, and providing that level of transparency. So starting with the Lake Champlain TMDL and how we're going to be reporting out, kind of already got a little bit at this, but I just wanted to summarize it in simple terms. We're going to be looking at the load reductions achieved by sector source, which is how the waste load allocation targets are set, and the load allocation targets are set, and by lake segment, because the Lake Champlain TMDL has separate targets for each lake segment and each sector source. So then we'll be measuring those reductions against the TMDL base load. So that was the modeled load between 2001 and 2010. So that's kind of our starting point, and then any reductions achieved after that point would be taken off of that base load. So then each year we'll know what new reductions were achieved based on newly implemented BMPs, and then we'll also be able to track cumulative phosphorus reductions for all active BMPs because we're not just going to be tracking, oh, the BMP was implemented and we're done here, but we also need to track the lifespan of that BMP and know that if we're giving it credit, then we need to know that it's actually functioning on the landscape and providing that phosphorus reduction benefit. And we're also going to be measuring that progress against our TMDL targets. So that's indicated by our waste load allocation and our load allocation. So we have the base load, we have our target, and then we have the actions implemented in between that we'll be tracking. And we are internally working through what this process will look like and getting ready to articulate that. But just a quick mock-up of what this might end up looking like is over time we would have the ability to demonstrate what our base load is, which is the TMDL base load, what our target is by the sector and the lake segment, and then track the cumulative reductions achieved over time, chipping away at that phosphorus load to reach our target. So this is purely a mock-up. Just want to make that clear, but just to give a visual of what this might look like as we're going through this process. And then now on to our next reporting function. We have the Vermont Clean Water Act, X64 requirements. And I already mentioned the different measures we're going to be reporting out on. So for social measures, we're tracking our level of outreach. We'll be reporting out on the level of outreach each year in this report. But in the long term, we're working on actually measuring the impact. So looking to social indicators so that we know the impact of those outreach efforts and not just the amount of outreach. Mm-hmm. So that process is currently under development and will likely be piloted in the next year. And then for our investment measures, we're tracking all of the financial information and funding sources associated with each of these projects. So we're going to be able to report out on how state funds were invested by sector and by watershed and county in the annual report. But I also want to make it known that if you wanted to drill down to the project level, you would be able to do that because all of the information is captured in our database. And then also a summary of performance measures, which I described earlier, reported out by sector and project type. And then for the environmental measures related to TMDL implementation, we'll be summarizing load reductions achieved relative to TMDL targets by watershed and by source sector. And then finally, a summary of co-benefits, which are currently under development as well. And those will be summarized by project type in our annual report. So finally, or not quite finally, but the next reporting function, Vermont results-based accountability. So some of the data and information we're tracking we can use to enhance the data of our current measures in results-based accountability. So for example, we are currently reporting on hours of outreach provided and received by the public and our stakeholders, and we're already reporting on acres of riparian corridor easements. But tracking systematically these efforts will enhance those data, and then we could potentially think about adding some new measures. So maybe addressing additional project types or TMDL implementation progress. So here's an example RBA results-based accountability report sheet. So you can see this on our website, and that kind of summarizes each year how we're doing. And then finally, the public. We want to make these data and information available at the project level to the public, and in the long term we're going to be working towards setting up some kind of an online database portal so that you can access this information. So as we kind of wrap up my talk here, I just wanted to take a moment to kind of give an overview of how this might impact our grantees or grant recipients. So the real goal of all of this is to streamline the current reporting that's done. So hopefully you'll find an efficiency with this process, and we're looking into options for taking the final performance reports that are completed by our grant recipients and streamlining that into some kind of an online report format or something that would be accessible but could also feed straight into our database to kind of streamline that process. So you might see something like that being implemented in the near future, and we're probably going to be adding co-benefit measures in addition to performance measures, but that will take a similar form as our performance measures, so tracked in a similar manner. And then we're going to have the addition of BMP tracking. And that's only going to apply to grants for implementation projects. and we're going to be providing additional outreach and training on that and getting your input before we put in any new requirements. So we'll be working through that with you, but that process is still under development. And finally, we want your feedback, so we'll definitely be getting grant recipient input on how the process works and incorporating your input into what's feasible, where you might need technical assistance, and how this process would best work for all parties involved. So thank you for listening to what's been going on with our efforts to put tracking system in place and all of the different applications for it. And I apologize that we don't have everything to share today because things are certainly still under development and a work in progress, but I'm also happy to answer any questions that I may not have addressed during my presentation. Plenty of time.
Yeah. So
Great.
if people have questions, you can either send them through the chat, or you actually should be able to unmute yourself and you can just ask us through the webinar. But either way works. Are there any questions?
A question. Do you know how this relates to anything going on in New York State or even in Tibet? Are you able to model after them, or can they model after you in terms of tracking?
Yeah, so the Lake Champlain TMDL accountability framework primarily applies to the Vermont portion of the basin, but Neil Kamen's in the room and he might be able to answer that because I haven't really been involved with discussions with New York or Quebec, but perhaps if there are updates in the other parts of the basin to their TMDL or restoration plan, something like this might be.
Have anything?
Do you want me to speak? Yeah. Okay. Hi. The Lake Champlain Basin Program maintains sort of an online database that tracks the achievement of the opportunities for action, which is the Lake Champlain plan. You know, the sort of holistic plan that addresses multiple aspects of Lake Champlain's pollution issues, not just phosphorus. And so there's a tracking system there that allows you to look at the broad level things that are getting done. Sometimes it's projects and sometimes it's policies. But this is like nothing that exists in most states. I think maybe Minnesota or maybe Wisconsin have a tracking system designed around this level of granularity. I'm not sure where else. California's got a nice monitoring program, tracking system, but this is like, yeah, definitely, yeah, this is the model. Yeah, Chesapeake Bay tracking system is probably the model. But
there may be opportunity to integrate in the future to capture some of the level of implementation in other parts of the Lake Champlain Basin.
It's like we have somebody typing a message, so we're just going to wait and see what she says.
I do see a comment in here that it says, seems like you would want to track acres of floodplain forest restored, as well as miles of river in the floodplain category. And yes, we are tracking the acres of riparian corridor buffer restored to forested land as one of our performance measures. The list of performance measures that I had put up was sort of a summary of examples, so it may not have been comprehensive.
How are we defining outreach conducted to, by the state agencies as clean water? So what would count for that? Does it have to be specific to the TMDL implementation plan, or are we looking at some of the outreach that happens more broadly?
It can be more broad than that because, as I explained earlier, the scope of our clean water activities that we're responsible for reporting on and tracking span all clean water activities, so across all sectors. So Act 64 really does set up very broad reporting requirements, and that does focus specifically on the work required by Act 64 and the Lake Champlain TMDL, but it's also supposed to capture the full spectrum of this kind of work statewide.
So we have a question from Regina. She says, can you clarify what the implementation table will look like in the tactical basin plans? Will there be an actual table in the plan, or will it really just be a fluid database that changes?
Well, I have folks from the monitoring assessment in the room, so I'd be happy to take a first shot, but I think you're more qualified to answer that than I am. Ethan?
Sure, that's a good question. what we have been using so far is a somewhat static table that lays out what the priorities are at the time that the basin plan is developed and issued, and that speaks to the actions that are projected to happen within the 5-year time frame. I think that the basin plan cycle takes. What we anticipate doing is that having the implementation table exist in the form of the project database, so that we can query that at any time. We can both update that with more current project information, as well as just query it for either different types of projects that are being implemented, or the actual environmental benefits that we're tracking that we can show per sub-basin or within the entire watershed. So as it stands now, yes, it's just a standalone table, but what we anticipate doing is to have that transition into that electronic format. And as you described, Emily, sort of having the project database portal so that folks can look in on different projects and see either by basin or by project type, or for a specific stream, they would be able to query that information and have that more readily accessible. So that would be more of a dynamic and constantly updated and accessible format that folks can then view the implementation table information.
Thanks, Ethan.
So next question, when do you expect to have the comprehensive list of performance measures available?
So we already have a comprehensive set of performance measures that are indicated by project type. If you go to water quality grant opportunities on our website for the Clean Water Initiative program, this is where we have our announcements for the Ecosystem Restoration Grant Program. There's a link there to an Excel spreadsheet that has a drop-down menu, and you indicate the project type, and it shows the performance measures associated with those.
Cool. And then another question. Can you explain the difference between outreach provided and outreach received?
Sure. So we're going to be tracking the hours of outreach provided. So that would be, if you're looking at an individual outreach event, say a public meeting, it's 2 hours long. So that 2 hours would be the duration of outreach provided. And then if there were 10 attendees, the outreach received would be the outreach provided multiplied by the attendees. So that would be 20 hours received.
Nice. Okay. Are there any more questions online or in the room? See if anyone starts rapidly typing.
Should we take?
So we're not this is us. Okay. And then take here, so everybody can hear us.
Oh, they can take themselves off mute.
They can if they want to, yeah. If they wanted to speak, they can unmute themselves. Otherwise, chat function is perfect. Doesn't look like anybody is typing anything. Well, if you have any remaining questions for Emily, her contact info is on the board, and so you can email her or call her. And I think with that, we will call it a day. So thank you all for coming, and our next brown bag is actually going to be next week, where we're going to be talking about LIDAR and its application for, how would you describe it, Allie? Application for prioritizing clean water projects.
Yes.
There we go. Struggling with the title, but hopefully you can all join us. It's June 2nd, which is next Thursday from 11 till noon. So hopefully you can join us then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Nice job.
Hi, Eric.
Cool.
That's what you're going to get at the TAC, Eric. Did you record it?
Perfect. Perfect. Sounds good.
I mean,
Really good.
literally do that.
And you could just lip sync.
It might actually not be a bad. Let's talk about it. It might not be a bad